In any avenue of leadership, there has to be a great deal of communication. So this is something that it's just part of the territory, particularly if you're going to work with people, you're going to have to communicate with them. And so this is true, obviously, in relationships. It's true in everything. But as a leader, it's really key because how we communicate needs to be done in a certain way to kind of mitigate as much as possible any kind of ambiguity, so any kind of mixed signals. So one thing as leaders, we want to make sure that when we give a message to somebody, it's not a message that they could say, I wonder what they meant by that. This isn't an exact science, of course, because there are times that whatever we say can be misconstrued. And this is really exacerbated in today's modern age with all the technology. I mean, how many of us have received a text and said, I wonder what they meant by that? Prior, in days past, if someone was talking to you, you could tell a lot by the tone of the voice. You can kind of judge, the spirit of what they were saying, maybe their attitude. But now we might get an email, we might get a text, might get a direct message, whatever. And so sometimes those are kind of open to interpretation. So it's kind of an art that we need to hone to be able to communicate effectively where people will understand what we're saying. And I'll give you a couple of examples of some historically that were communicated that caused quite a stir and maybe were misinterpreted. And then another biblical example, because, preserving the Christian family, we're all about everything being biblically based. There's a lot of ideas about communication, and a lot of them are good. You can learn a lot about it, watching videos, reading books, articles, whatever. But I really like to see examples in Scripture for everything that we do and that we teach. But first, a historical example. In 1956, November of 56, Nikita Khrushchev was addressing the Polish embassy, and he gave his famous speech that ended with, "We will bury you." And I'm not going to read the whole transcript of the speech, but if you look at it and you read it in context, it talks about the fact essentially that their kind of government, in his opinion, was going to outlast ours. And so he said something to the effect of, whether you like it or not, history is on our side. If you don't like us, don't come and visit us, and we won't visit you, along those lines. And then he concluded by saying, "We will bury you." Well, that was essentially the shot heard around the world. It's like, oh, wow, that's almost a declaration of war. And this, of course, during the height of the Cold War, some 10, 11 years after the end of World War II. And so that communication kind of ricocheted, and people took it as a threat. And while he certainly was probably trying to be antagonistic, a lot of historians have concluded that the actual context of that gives more of the connotation that we will attend your funeral rather than we will cause your funeral. Now that's quite a difference. I mean, if you attend someone's funeral, you just outlived them. If you caused it, there was a problem there. So that was a communication that, because of the way, and some of it I'm sure is interpretation of languages, etc. But basically that's an example of how sometimes we can say something and not be entirely what we meant. So as leaders, we need to make sure that we convey to those that are in our charge, or those that are working with us, exactly what needs to be done, whether it's a ministry task or whatever it is. And an example from Scripture is found in the story of Nabal and David. It's a story where David was protected the men of Nabal out in the field. He didn't know them. They wasn't something that was in his charge to do. He just did it. And the men really appreciated it, the ones that were watching Nabal's sheep and all that stuff. And they, even by their own mouth, their testimony was, he was a wall unto us day and night. And so he was really, he was just really good to them. David and his band of men, 400, 600, however many he had at the moment, they protected him. So David's men were hungry, and he went to Nabal and sent a message and said, "Hey, we took care of your stuff, nothing was missing. Can we have a little food?" And the message came back, and this is one that was not misinterpreted. It was one, he came back and said, "Who's David? Who's the son of Jesse that I should take my food from my servants and give it to you?" And the scripture says he railed on him. And so that kind of communication, and what happened was, or what could have happened, he could have had an opportunity to be in a league with someone that was going to end up being very powerful and influential. But instead, his communication was done in such a way as to say, "I don't have time to mess with you." He was really unkind in his response. And to me, that just makes me think, how many times can we, if we're not careful, now he was intentionally trying to just be, mean about it, but intentionally or unintentionally, we can come across to those that are looking to us for direction. Maybe they come with a request, with a need, something we should be in our position helping them with. And how many times can we answer roughly, as it were? Well, if you read the rest of the story, David strapped on his sword. He was ready to go just wipe everything out. And then Nabal's wife ended up intervening. But the whole point is that there could have been something really positive that happened, but it was totally based on communication. David had a simple request. Hey, can we have a little bread? We've been taking care of you guys, haven't charged you anything. And Nabal said, no, I'm not giving you anything. And so it ended up being a bad situation for him. So the principle is to communicate what we desire in a way that people can understand it, and then also to be able to receive that communication that comes back to us.